So welcome back to the magnificent seventh edition of the all new Deep Analysis podcast. Myself and Alan here again this time. If you've joining us for the first time, well, welcome. You've got a whole bunch of back catalogue to go through and enjoy, should you wish. But just to give you an idea of what the format of this podcast is, it's very simple. The two of us have three topics. We talk for roughly about 10 minutes a topic. That may differ from time to time, but we average about 10 minutes a topic for those three topics over 30 minutes of things that are top of mind. So things that we've published, things that are going on in the news, not just the general news, but specifically to our world of unstructured data automation, and maybe some speaking gigs that we've been doing, and give you some extra information on top of that. Which brings us to a kind of repeating topic, which in the past we've called Where in the world has Alan been? But we've done Where in the world has Alan been a couple of times, and but Alan has been on the road the last week or so, and so talking specifically, Alan, about AI and supply chain. You were at the conference that I keep wanting to call Parcelforce, because in my head there's a big parcel company, used to be part of Royal Mail in the UK, called Parcelforce, and of course there are other conferences that we'll come to later on that have Force as part of their name. But Parcel Forum you were at last week in Tennessee, talking about supply chain and AI.
Yeah, it was a really good conference. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the preeminent event for the packaging industry, and I'm smiling because nobody ever even thinks that there is a packaging industry. I mean, we get packages right at our door. Stuff is packaged to go on a container ship, whatever, right? It's one of those things you never stop and think about. It's a $1 trillion global business, right? Not supply chain, packaging.
Just the packaging.
It's hard to, I can't get my head around it, I'm being honest. And I was giving the keynote there.
Well, you see, you made the mistake of telling me afterwards that you thought it went really well. So I said, well, because you thought it went really well, I'm going to make sure that we try to redo some bits here to prove to you that we did go really well.
It did go really well. And I say that not to sort of pat myself on the back so much as I was really worried about it. I mean, as an event organizer, I've known many years, Alison Lloyd, she's lovely. And she asked me to do this keynote. And I just, as usual, I was like, yeah, all right then. And I thought, what have I got myself into? Because do I know something about supply chain? Yeah, I do. But, when you're at a conference with hundreds of people who've spent their entire, I'm just thinking, why have I agreed to do this? So it went a lot better than I thought it would. But it was so interesting in that, and we've got a slide up here, and obviously if you're listening to this on the audio version, you can't read the slide, but the key thing we were talking, or the key things that we were talking about here is that, there's a surge of interest in AI in the supply chain, as there is everywhere. I mean, the supply chain's no exception. But the supply chain is interesting because it's been one of those sectors that's, on the one hand, been at the cutting edge of tech. And on the other hand, it's decades behind everybody else. Right. So what was one of the first areas to ever embrace blockchain or IoT? Supply chain. Walk into, as I have, walk into any sort of office associated with a massive warehouse or 3PL or manufacturer or whatever, right? And what do you see? Piles and piles and piles of paper. Right. So it's this sort of dichotomy. On the one hand, it's still very paper bound. On the other, they're really experimenting with very advanced technologies.
Well, ultimately, it does require, particularly talking about packaging, this ultimately is going to be a physical manifest, a physical item that ends up at a physical location at a specific time.
Well, there's that, but there's also, and again, not an expert on packaging, there's a lot of math involved here. Right, there's a lot of math involved here. Very, very, very accurate measurements to do with costing, to do with packaging sizing, to do with weights, etc., etc. So this was sort of the gist of the keynote. On the one hand, AI is a perfect fit, right? Because what does AI do really well? Math, right? It does that kind of thing really well. On the other hand, is the data any good? No.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that just to kind of paraphrase where we were, what I wasn't going to try and do was to take in a whole 60-minute keynote and try and get out. So I pulled out individual slides from your presentation deck that I thought we were talking about, and the one up on screen, which doesn't feel like it's very AI related, but actually is very, very AI related, is that number one business driver in 2024 being error reduction.
Exactly. So on the one hand, in supply chain, there's an understandable focus on, we've got all this data, we need to predict things, we'll use AI, blah, 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 right? On the other hand, where are the costs? Where are the unexpected, where are the unwanted costs? Errors, right? Manual key entry, a decimal point missing, a SKU that's been incorrectly a barcode that's been placed on the wrong packet. I mean, just stuff, right? Errors, and it kills them, And so, you know, so it was anyway, so that resonated. We talked a lot about that, and we talked about, you know, document processing, etc. But this slide, which I've used multiple times before, I'd have to say, in different formats, but there's a couple of things on here on this slide, which again, if you're on the audio version, you can't see, but the big one that we've bolded here is, you know, we've always done it this way.
So it's about changing mindsets, really, from the kind of present to the future.
It's about that, because change involves risk, right? Change involves risk. And a lot of these people have tried things like, you know, scanning documents and OCR, right? We used to use that as a standard example. They tried this stuff 15, 20 years ago. It didn't work. I mean, it worked, but it wasn't good enough, right? It just wasn't good enough. So they're reluctant. They've had the fingers burned. They've had their fingers burnt. But there's an opportunity now, because, as we know, the accuracy levels are so much higher today, right? They're so much higher than a human. There's an opportunity here. And if you just do that, you reduce the number of errors.
Which turns out, in a sort of parallel existence, we've been doing some research work, some custom research work on behalf of a client recently, where we're actually starting to cost out what actually the solving of relatively small errors, when you factor them through really a medium-sized organization, what that actually means in dollars and cents and hours spent for employees per year, and fairly small errors. You know, funny enough, they compound to quite a big number, right?
Down to an enormous number. I mean, let's be honest, we were pretty taken aback. Actually, that report you're mentioning, I shared a copy of it with our colleague Victoria yesterday, just because I said, oh, hey, we've got it. And she came out like, wow, the client's going to be happy with this. These are, yeah, I mean, yeah. But here's the thing. When people have been thinking about ROI, when they've been thinking about business cases, it's usually about cutting jobs, right? It's usually about doing things faster, doing the same thing, but doing it faster, right? That's, you know, in a nutshell. Well, we focused instead on taking errors out. Whoa, that's something that's been overlooked. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying that's totally been overlooked in the history of management consulting, but it is a small niche, and it's one that I think in a world of AI we should focus much more on.
Yeah, and particularly when, and just the slide I got up right now, it's talking specifically or more generally about AI. Well, the thing you have in bold amongst the bullet points for those of us who can't necessarily see the screen, is that, you know, trains on your data, right? So that thing about data quality and the data quality assurance at the beginning, or even before you start AI projects, you know, I think we're getting probably preaching to the converted a little bit here, but it's slightly dull. It doesn't feel very exciting or cutting edge, but getting your data right at the get-go as an upstream activity is pretty damn important.
It really is. And I remember when we did the AI training course, what was that, 6 years ago or something, Cash and I, and we were, I mean, I can remember putting the slides up in workshops or whatever, and we'd have this slide that says, you know, it was a pie chart, right? I keep it real simple. It was a pie chart. This is what a data scientist does all day. Yeah. 80% of it cleaning data. Yeah. And it was a showstopper every time that slide came up, right?
Yeah, I mean, now it seems to get called fine tuning.
fine
tuning.
You
Fine
can call it
tuning
what you want.
but fine tuning in practicality is fixing underscores, overscores, misidentifications, which you're fixing either at the data, you're fixing at some kind of ETL level between the data and the model, or you're in there with spanners, basically changing what's referred to as weights and biases. And I mean biases in a model sense, not biases in a human sense, within there to try and make sure that the result comes out at the other end how you think you do. So again, it's still working on a human perception of what the model should produce.
Well, right, but the data scientist is also handicapped right from the get-go because they're told this silo of data is really good. They don't know. They don't know which file, which they don't know, right? Yeah. Maybe nobody knows which one's accurate or not. Nobody knows. It's a tough one, and it's one of those things that people like to avoid. They don't want to talk about.
But linking together, just another slide on about documents and AI. Initial, very much in our world, you wouldn't necessarily think from the broad coverage of AI that they actually have anything in common. But if you spend any time reading our content, they have a lot in common, and it's kind of a lot of what we're writing about right now.
Yeah, NLP, NLU, OCR, NLG, generative AI, whatever. What do they all have in common? Unstructured data.
Yeah.
Text, images, whatever, barcodes. That's our world, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because our industry doesn't do a very good job of waving the flags from the rooftops and saying, "Hey, that's us, guys." Doesn't, but it is. It's what we do. But I mean, just to repeat that thing, I mean, you cannot say it often enough. And again, I'll go back to Parcel Forum, right? These are a very smart audience, plenty of them, nice bunch. But they really wanted to hear this because they really wanted an external person to go back and quote internally, I think, right?
Yeah.
Our accurate data, it ain't gonna work. Poor quality data in, poor quality decisions out. It is as simple as that. It is actually as simple as that. So going back to Parcel Forum very quickly, something I knew about, and I said to them, how many of you have a warehouse management system, WMS?
Lots of hands go up.
Yeah, loads and loads of hands go up. How many believe that the data inside your WMS is accurate?
Lots of hands go down.
Because that's the real world, buddy.
Yeah. Right. And they're relying to a degree on, and they rely, and this isn't just weighed at them, but in general rely on a wisdom of the organization which constantly fills that gap in without anybody realizing necessarily that gap exists or what it takes out of each weekly cycle, daily cycle to fill in that gap. Oh well, yeah, because what you had to do, you had to go just change that last digit, or you had to go and move it from that column to that column. We just have to do that or it doesn't work.
Yeah, and again, a cliche, but nevertheless pretty darn accurate. You ask the senior managers in one of these companies, the most senior managers in one of these companies, the executives, about the WMS, they'll talk about it as if it's God's gift. You get, the closer you get to the shop floor, the more the inconsistencies and problems become aware. But who's making the decisions on AI?
Yes.
Not the shop floor.
Yeah. And I think it bridges it quite nicely into, I mean, stuff that we will be writing about again this year, but we published earlier in the year about work intelligence, about this not being about replacing humans, but augmenting humans, allowing them to do what they do best, to help these processes work better. And as you said, involving those humans in the design of processes, making sure that what they do that gets filled in is always mapped as part of those processes when we start to think about automation in particular. This takes us nicely into our next topic, actually. Almost as if we planned this, is really important. And if your starting point as well, before we started our thought about AI, we know the result is, and our result is going to be headcount reduction. You are likely to be heading to a big failure at some point along
that is a message that a lot of people still just don't get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that, we hear a lot, and often we hear a lot when projects are in progress, if not completed and unsatisfactory, that was our starting point. It wasn't a hypothesis we wanted to test. It was a conclusion that had to be met. So I deliberately didn't put your conclusion slides. I'm making sure the people at Parcel Forum got your conclusions. I don't know whether they are recording or slides are going to go up. Well, I'll put some links to the stuff into the show notes, as I always do for this. So the ultimate conclusions of your keynote will stay in the minds and in the loving memories of the attendees. So we're not giving that away for free.
Well, let's hope so. I enjoyed it anyway.
So something else that we've got going on right now, and I wanted to make sure we cover it. There's an awful lot here where I like to think that, amongst all of the general wittery, I think, between us, there are one or two, bon mots that are quite useful here. There's something maybe you can help us with. And apologies if you've already seen us asking for this on other things of social media. But we're at the moment running a citizen developer survey. Why are we running a citizen developer survey? Well, last time we talked a little bit about citizens developers and AI. What we're talking about just now is actually involving the workforce within the design of automation is really important. And funny enough, that's kind of exactly what the idea of the use of citizen developers are, which is basically to use resources inside the organization which are non-technical, but are really vested in the process to be able to help build, test, launch, manage automations, right? I mean, that's kind of the promise, Alan. Am I summing that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the key thing to note here, as with any survey, ideally, we certainly have thoughts on this, but we don't have conclusions on it. It's a bit, I have to use this term once again, generative AI. When you step away from all the hype, what's really happening in the real world, right? It's hard to know. It's hard to know. If you listen to, I'm not going to name and shame, but if you listen to the vendors, you'd think everybody is moving to an army of citizen developers, and and maybe that's true. Maybe it's true. I suspect it's not true. And we really want to know what's really going on. The one thing we know for sure is that it is getting easier and easier to develop applications.
So the technical side, the ability, the median ability of the tools to be able to take your citizen developer from a starting point to the point where they're productive, the tooling is good, and that's now imbued with additional AI smarts as well to help code complete or add best practices or to do suggestions. So all new stuff, or the whole armory of additional tools is going in. That's not really kind of the point of what we're trying to get out of this, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, because that's a given, and that's not even new, right? You could trace that back to moving from green screens to window. I mean,
I was there.
Yeah, well, so was I. But that's the reality, right? A lot of things which once upon a time needed somebody in IT to develop, you can do on your desktop now. It's a click and a push, right? So that's been a steady progress, but we are really accelerating that now. But there's bigger questions around. I mean, one of the questions we asked in the survey, and again, open mind as to what the results will be. Okay, so all these people are developing applications. How do you govern that? What structures are in place for that? That's a lot of applications. If we're going back to green screen time, right? Well, we'll go back to Y2K, and anybody who doesn't know about that can Google it, right? I mean, the fact is, shadow IT. Yeah, it's cool that you can develop your own applications, but who's going to own that for the rest of its life? What's its impact? So it's not that we're against it, it's just that this is an evolving space, and unfortunately or fortunately, things like governance and security and whatever, they have to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we don't cover it in the survey because it's not the point of it, is what's the kind of motivation behind doing it? Because a lot of the motivation behind it is where I worry it. Hey, you know what's really expensive? Developers. And do you know what's much cheaper? Not developers. How about we use not developers to be developers, right? Now, I can see that being legit, but that's not necessarily kind of the right spirit. The right spirit is a little bit what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago is, hey, let's take subject matter experts, right? Who actually, you know what? Expensive. Let's add some development skills, also expensive, and end up with something that's expensive but can do everything. So this isn't about cost reduction. This is about making sure that we utilize all of the resources we've got to make processes better.
Yeah, and to name and not shame, but to praise, if anything. I give credit to Appian. I mean, a few years ago, I was meeting with them at their event in Fort Lauderdale, just after the pandemic. I think it was the first event after the COVID pandemic that I visited. And they had this big thing about citizen developers, but give them credit. They had this huge training and education thing around it too, right? Because they kept saying, you can't just let anybody loose on this.
Yeah.
And full credit to them. But to your point, the subject matter expert, they're the ones who know how this really should be working.
Yeah.
Let's empower them. And that's so we're not against citizen developers, not at all. It's just that it's a bit messy at the moment. What does it really look like? And where's it really going? We don't know.
So the summary of that really is survey. Please do the survey. It takes about 5 minutes. It's about 17, 18 questions. Do
you know what? We timed it a couple of times. It takes like 3 minutes. It's really big amount. And
we will be, of course, therefore sharing the results of that back to not only those people who did the survey, but eventually anyone who has an interest in this. We're going to be writing about that.
Yeah, this is not going to be behind a firewall. We want this to be shared.
No, and as ever, we'll make sure that we put the links to that within the show notes. If you're looking at this through a format where you can't see the show notes, or we haven't published the show notes yet, they're often a little 24 hours behind, then find any of us on LinkedIn when we've mentioned it. Trust me, in the last few days, because we want to make sure we get the broadest number of people there as possible. This is a very AI compliant show this time. So if you're sick of hearing about it, I'm really sorry. If you're really here to hear about that, I'm glad we can help. I wrote a post back in the beginning of the summer, really kind of complaining. And these are both kind of complaints. So sorry if you don't like complaining, but I'm going to complain for a little bit here. I wrote a post at the beginning of the summer about AI, particularly around Gen AI, and the predictions of doom. Machines were going to take over and destroy us all, and like this, just be cool. You're shouting at autocorrect. It's nowhere near as difficult as or dangerous as you think about. And that was very much directed at kind of mass media organizations and a little bit towards the industry as well, around their calls for regulation. And I kind of hope that as that cooled down a little bit, it wasn't a front page news or a major story on the TV news. It could go back to being maybe an industry story, and we'd be cooler about it a little bit. Last week I published something else, which is kind of like a follow-up thing, which is a little bit about where we've gone in those 2 or 3 months since, and it was prompted a little bit by Dreamforce, so the Salesforce conference last week, which they billed as being the world's largest AI conference.
AI conference, yeah,
which is cool. I mean, it's a big conference, and a lot of it was talking about AI, so I'm not looking to challenge that. But I came away from that with a little bit of disquiet. Not entirely. It's a huge conference. There are thousands of really good sessions, but you do tend to end up being rather dominated by what happens at keynotes and what happens when senior members of staff are on stage. And a couple of times during the keynote, I heard Gen AI accused of being a liar, or it lies and it tells untruths. And I'm thinking, well, that's giving something a personality that it doesn't have. If we think a little bit, over the last few months, we've heard the term, hallucinations, or we say that Gen AI hallucinates, and I kind of let it go because, it's a term that's been used a lot. But again, it feels into that same kind of disquieting a little bit, which is saying, hey, this thing is kind of alive. Just so we're clear, it absolutely isn't alive. It's not alive whatsoever. It has none of those capabilities. But the moment we start to talk about it as if it's alive, it somehow kind of feels a bit more dangerous, a bit more difficult to control. Which is fine if you're a futurologist, if you're one of those people who actually your business is almost selling a prediction of doom and singing how it can be averted. This becomes a little bit different when you're a software company who at the same time is saying, oh, by the way, what we're bringing to you here at our conference is a system of controls for doing it, because we're telling you something's dangerous, but at the same time saying, hey, we're the only people here who you can trust to control it. You're almost a little bit, and I talk about this in passing in the blog post itself, a little bit in relation to King Kong. To look, here's this massive monster that I have successfully chained it, and only you can trust me to control it.
And it's a really tricky one, because I mean, I stress this all the time. I mean, look, you can't roll the clock back; it's not going to change. But AI isn't actually intelligent, right? Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. And AI isn't half as powerful as people think it is. We go back to what we were talking about before: garbage in, garbage out, right? However, can AI be very, very dangerous and destructive? Yes, it can. I mean, yes, it can. Now, is it the AI's fault? No, it's not a human. It's not an intelligent being. It's whoever used it. It's whoever trained it. It's whoever.
And in the case of the generative technology where we are today, it's just making a wrong guess. It's just making a wrong guess. That's all it is.
But you know, purely from a psychological point, I mean, when you think about it, right? I mean, we've gone into Gen AI a lot in the past, but one of the key things here is it's been trained to be convincing.
Yeah.
I used to do a lot of visiting inside prisons as a volunteer, right? I come across a lot of people who could be very, very convincing. It's not always a good trait. And that's the point. You know, you've really got to think about what you're doing here. I mean, in the news in the UK at the moment, not that I follow it that closely these days, there's all the things about the sub-postmasters, right?
Yeah, the Horizon project. Yeah,
the Horizon, and it's used too many times probably here, but you know, you have like the Compass system, which is used still in the justice system here, which is deeply flawed. The thing is, there's lots and lots of examples of this, but when we start pointing the finger at AI, saying it lied, it did this, it did that, it lose, well, don't pass the buck onto the tool. It's the person who configured it. It's the person who's using it. It's the person who owns it. It's your problem.
Yeah, and I think
your problem.
I think in part this is because actually what people want to be talking about, what you know, CEO level people want to be talking about is not where technology is now. They want to be talking about AGI. They want to be talking about artificial general intelligence, which is something which is still largely theoretical, right? But
yeah, and we know, look, this is almost a religious debate, but may in fact always be theoretical.
Well, I think we were talking about the kind of John Searle Chinese room stuff yesterday, you and I, about you know, is technology ever capable of displaying intelligence, or is it always producing a simulation? And the reason that I was in my mind was that I was listening to a podcast earlier in the week talking about humans following recipes, and at what point when a human follows a recipe are they not cooking but purely simulating cooking? It's an interesting philosophical idea. If you don't know you're making a roux, but making a roux, as an example from a cookery thing, are you just following a set of instructions, or are you displaying cooking intelligence? And I think these are interesting philosophical discussions to have.
And we can take it a step further, displaying intelligence and actually being intelligent.
Yes. And I think that's the point of the Chinese room experiment, isn't it? And I'll put links to all this in the show notes, so don't worry.
No, but it's a good one, and it's one we should be having, but it always does come back to it. And it's a horrible analogy, which I shouldn't use anymore, but you know, we used to live in New England, right? We had a big vegetable plot. And I would look at all these new shiny spades and shovels and lawnmowers and everything. Yeah, without human actually doing something skillful with them, they didn't do much value. And I have no skills in gardening.
I guess
it's very much the same. It's a very powerful set of tools.
And to take this just a little bit back to that kind of almost the idea of selling defense. Look, neither of us work in InfoSec, and I know a big chunk of how InfoSec sells is selling on, you know, the fear we can protect you from something. That's something that we don't, outside kind of compliance, we don't really tend to have within our world. What I don't wish to see is people being dissented from wanting to experiment because they're worried about something we've imbued with intent that does not have any intent. And I think it's a dangerous game for those people who are simultaneously wanting to sell the technology on both sides of it to use those kind of concepts. And I think that's probably why I was a little bit miffed coming away from
just
that
an
keynote.
opportunity for a shout out to a good friend of both yours and mine, who is one of the leading lights in the world of info security, the only man.
Javad.
You're listening to Javad Malik, right?
Yeah.
If you don't know Javad, if you don't know his podcast, if you don't know his videos, you should definitely check him out, because he does a great job of taking the most concept-laden, complex things and ideas, right, and bringing them down to earth. He's awesome. But you're right, it's the same thing. But if you remember, just quickly back to Javad, what Javad used to teach us was there's all the technology, but at the end of the day, it all comes back to people. Yeah.
Well, again, it's a nice way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Because ultimately what we were talking about at the beginning and throughout was the important role that people play, and how so much about this is not about reducing the number of people to deploying them in a way in which the human skills can be used to their best, which is kind of at the root of what we were talking about, continue to talk about around work intelligence and lots of other parts of what the practice does. Thank you for joining us. Well, again, next time there'll be 3 more topics, 30 minutes to discuss them in. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you're joining us next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.